First thing I noticed wasn't the lake glittering past the cedar deck or the fieldstone fireplace I'd hauled half my savings into building 40 years ago. It was my granddaughter on her hands and knees in the front hall, scrubbing road salt off the slate with a rag that had gone gray, her wrists raw and pink from the cold water in the pail beside her. And before I go any further, let me say my name plainly, so nobody listening can twist what I'm about to tell you. I'm Winifred Calloway, 72 years old, born in Sault Ste. Marie, and that cottage on Georgian Bay was mine before I signed it over to my son the winter his wife passed. But the girl on the floor, hunched and shrinking, didn't look like anyone who belonged to a family that owned anything at all. She didn't hear me come in. The mudroom door has stuck since 1989. You have to lean your shoulder into it, and the cold air came in with me, and still she didn't lift her head. Her breath fogged a little in the hall. They keep that front entry like an icebox to save on the propane, I'd learn later, but the rest of the house was warm enough for the people sitting in it. You're tracking slush, a woman's voice said from the great room. Sharp, bored. Wipe it before it pools. I knew that voice. It belonged to my son's second wife. I won't call her my daughter-in-law, because she never once acted like family to me. She was reclined on the sofa. I'd reupholstered myself, a glass of something amber resting on her knee, and beside her sat her own grown daughter, scrolling a phone, not looking up. My son was in the leather chair by the fire with his stocking feet on the ottoman, and he didn't look up either. The girl on the floor jolted and dragged the rag faster, and that was when she finally turned her head toward the draft, toward me, and I saw her eyes. Lord help me. I have thought about those eyes every night since. They weren't frightened. Frightened would have been better. They were empty, scraped clean, the way a window looks when there's no light on inside the house. She squinted at me like she was trying to place a face from a long time ago, from before something happened that made remembering dangerous. My own granddaughter, my boy's only child. And she did not know me. Her name is Daisy. She was 6 the last time I held her, gap-toothed and sticky from a butter tart, and she had called me Gran because she couldn't manage the whole thing. 14 years I'd been gone. And I'll tell you exactly why before this is over, because I know what you're thinking. I know. But right then, kneeling on that floor, in a thin cardigan, with her knuckles split from the cold, she looked 30 years older than the 20 she'd just turned. "Can I help you?" the second wife said, finally glancing my way like I was a Jehovah's Witness on the porch. "We're not buying anything." My son's feet came off the ottoman. He sat up. I watched it land on him slow, the way recognition lands on a man who has spent a long time hoping a certain person would never walk back through the door. "Mom," he said. Just that. Flat as the lake in January. I didn't answer him yet. I was watching Daisy. She'd gone still, the rag forgotten in her fist, and her lips moved like a word was trying to climb up out of her and couldn't find the air. Gran. I saw it shape itself and die. She looked down at the floor again, fast. Like meeting my eyes too long would cost her something she couldn't afford. If you've ever walked into a room and found someone you love made smaller than you left them, you know the sound the heart makes. It isn't loud. It's a quiet, surgical little crack. I felt it, and I let it happen, and then I let it go cold. Because grief wasn't going to be any use to me in that house. Something else would. I set my overnight bag down on the slate, right in the slush she'd been scrubbing. "I came a long way," I said to my son. "I'll be staying a few days." The second wife laughed, a short little puff through her nose. "There isn't really room. There are 4 bedrooms," I said. "I built 3 of them." Nobody said anything to that. The fire popped. Daisy picked the rag back up and started scrubbing again, in tight little circles over the same clean spot, and that, more than the empty eyes, more than the raw hands, that was the thing that told me how bad it was. A person doesn't scrub a clean floor unless they've learned that stopping is worse. I asked to use the washroom. The second wife waved a hand toward the hall like she was granting me a great favor. I went, and I did not use the washroom. I stood by the little window at the end of the hall where the cell signal reaches, the same dead spot I used to curse when I lived here, and I took out my phone and I dialed the only number that mattered. A man's voice answered on the second ring. My lawyer. He's handled my affairs since before my husband died, and he doesn't waste words, which is why I kept him. Pull the Cottage Trust, I said. The original. And the letter. A pause. Then, how bad, I said, and hung up, because Daisy had stopped scrubbing and I could feel her listening through the wall the way only people who've been hurt learn to listen. I want to back up now and tell you the thing you've been waiting to hear because I'd be a coward to leave it out. 14 years. How does a grandmother let 14 years go by? Here is the truth, and it doesn't make me proud. When my son's first wife, Daisy's mother, a lovely girl, gone too young from a heart thing nobody saw coming, when she passed, my boy fell apart, and within the year he'd taken up with the woman on my sofa. She did not like me. That part was simple, and I could have lived with it. What I couldn't see at the time was how patient she was. She didn't fight with me. She just slowly made the air between my son and me too expensive to breathe. Calls that didn't get returned. A Christmas where the dates didn't work out. Then, a letter, typed, signed in my son's name, telling me he needed space, that my visits upset the household, that I should wait to be invited. I waited. God forgive me, I waited, and the invitation never came, and every year I told myself next year, and I sent the cards and the checks for Daisy's birthday, and got no thank you, and assumed a girl that age just doesn't write. I found out later that not one of those cards reached her. The second wife kept them. I'll get to that. But understand, I didn't abandon my granddaughter. I was walled off from her, brick by patient brick, by a woman who knew that the surest way to take a family's money is to first take the family apart. I should have driven up here years ago and put my shoulder to that stepped door. I didn't, and I will carry that. But I am not the villain of this, and neither is the girl on the floor. I came back at all because of a phone call I almost didn't answer. A number I didn't know. A young man's voice, nervous. He'd gone to high school with Daisy. He'd seen her at the Foodland in town buying the cheapest bread, paying in coins, flinching when a man's voice came over the PA. She doesn't talk to anybody anymore, Mrs. Calloway, he said. I found you through your husband's old curling club. I just somebody should know. I was on the road by 6 the next morning. 11 hours of the 400, and then the back roads, and a Tim Hortons cup going cold in the holder, and the whole way I prayed I was being a foolish old woman jumping at shadows. I wasn't. That first night they put me in the smallest bedroom, the one that used to be the sewing room, and I lay awake listening to the house. I heard the second wife's voice carry down the hall, easy and unbothered, and my son's lower murmur agreeing with whatever she said. And around 11, when the house went dark, I heard something else. A door I didn't recognize, down past the laundry where the old root cellar stairs are. I got up in my nightgown and my bare feet on the cold pine, and I followed the sound, and I found Daisy carrying a folded blanket and a plastic jug of water down those stairs. "Honey," I whispered, "where are you going?" She froze. In the dark her face was just shapes, but I heard her swallow. "It's fine," she said. "It's where I sleep. It's quieter down there. I like it." She said it the way you say a thing you've been made to say so many times it comes out smooth. The basement smelled of damp concrete and the iron tang of the old well. There was a cot, one blanket, a bare bulb on a string. My granddaughter slept in the cellar of a house with 4 warm bedrooms, and she'd been taught to call it a preference. I didn't make a scene. That's the hardest thing to explain to people, why I didn't scream the roof down right then. But I'd spent 40 years running a marine supply business in a town full of men who thought a woman couldn't read a contract. And I'd learned that the loudest person in the room is almost never the one who wins. You don't tip your hand, you gather. So I said, "It is quieter down here." And I sat on the edge of that cot with her, and I let her lean her head against my shoulder for the first time in 14 years. And I felt how thin she'd gotten through her shoulder blades, and I memorized every single thing I saw. In the morning, I made myself useful and invisible. I cooked. I'm good in a kitchen, and the second wife was happy enough to let me earn my keep, which suited me, because a kitchen is where you hear things. Over the next 2 days, I learned the shape of it. The cottage was in my son's name now. I'd signed it to him the year his first wife died, wanting him to have the security, never dreaming who'd be standing next to him a year later. But that was just the start of what they'd taken. Daisy's mother had left her a little, you see. Not a fortune. A locked-in retirement account. A small inheritance from her own people in Owen Sound, meant to come to Daisy when she turned 18. I knew it existed because I'd helped her mother set it up before she got sick. It would have been a cushion, a down payment someday, a girl's running start at her own life. It was gone. I found that out the way you find out most rotten things, by accident, and all at once. The second wife sent Daisy and me into town for groceries, the first time they'd let her out of their sight in my presence, and I think it was a mistake on their part, a small slip of confidence. In the truck, on the gravel stretch where there's no signal and no one can hear you, with her hands twisting in her lap, my granddaughter told me everything. "When I turned 18," she said, looking out the window so she wouldn't have to look at me, "there was money. From Mom. They said it had to go into the household because Dad's back was bad and he couldn't work, and the cottage had a special assessment. The septic, the road, and if we didn't pay, we'd lose the house. And where would I go? They had me sign at the credit union. She never used the woman's name, I noticed. She called her, the way you'd name a weather system. Her brother works there. He was nice about it. He said I was being so mature." Her voice did something then, folded in on itself. "I didn't know you could say no. I didn't know there was a no. There it is. That's the whole crime in one sentence. And it's a crime they commit on the gentle ones. I didn't know there was a no." "And the septic?" I asked, very evenly, both hands on the wheel. "There wasn't one," she said. "I drove past the township office one day and asked, just I don't know why. I just wanted to know. There was never any assessment. There was never any special anything." She started to cry then, the silent kind, the kind that doesn't ask for comfort because it's learned comfort doesn't come. "I gave away my mom's money for a thing that wasn't real. I'm so stupid. I'm so—" "You stop that," I said, and I pulled over onto the shoulder by the swamp where the red-winged blackbirds were, and I took my granddaughter's face in my two hands. "You were lied to by people whose whole job every day was lying to you. That is not stupid. That is robbed. There's a difference, and you're going to learn it. If you have ever watched someone you love apologize for being cheated, you'll understand the thing that hardened in my chest at the side of that road. It wasn't rage. Rage is hot and stupid, and it makes you sign things you shouldn't. This was cold, and it had edges, and it knew exactly what it wanted. What it wanted was paper. Because here is what those two never bothered to find out about me, sitting in their stolen house. I don't gift property the way most people do. When I signed that cottage to my son, my lawyer, the same one with the dry voice, made me put it in a trust, with a clause I'd half argued against at the time because it felt like distrust of my own boy. The clause said the property and any assets flowing from the family were held for the benefit of the line, my son and his issue, meaning Daisy, and that any transfer, encumbrance, or extraction of family assets obtained through fraud, coercion, or undue influence could be reviewed and unwound by the trustee. I thought it was lawyers' paranoia. I thought I was protecting against a bad business partner, a lawsuit, a bankruptcy. I never once thought I was protecting my grandchild from the people sleeping in my bedroom. I was the trustee. Me, still. They'd never changed it because they never knew to look. We drove home with the groceries, and I made a shepherd's pie, and I smiled and complimented the second wife on the new drapes, which I'd noticed were the exact pattern out of a catalogue Daisy's mother used to keep on her nightstand, dog-eared to that page. And the next morning, before anyone was up, I stood at the dead spot in the hall, and I called my lawyer back. I need everything, I told him. The trust, the transfer records on the girl's account. Her brother-in-law facilitated it at the credit union. There'll be a name, the township record showing there was no assessment, and I need you to drive up. A pause. Bring whatever lets us freeze it all today. That's a long drive, he said. You bill for it, I said. Bring a witness who isn't me. He came the next afternoon, and he didn't come alone. I'd made one other call, to a woman I'd known for 30 years who'd retired from the OPP and now did victim services work in the district, the kind of person who knows which form goes where and who to phone so it doesn't sit in a basket for 6 weeks. She came in a plain car, in plain clothes, with a binder, and she sat at my kitchen table and listened to Daisy for 2 hours while I made tea and stayed out of it, because some things a girl has to say in her own words to someone whose job it is to write them down. The reckoning didn't happen with shouting. I want you to know that, because the movies lie about this. It happened quietly, on a Tuesday, in the great room with the fire going, and it was worse for them than shouting, because there was nothing to push against. My lawyer laid the trust on the coffee table. The original. The second wife glanced at it the way she glanced at me, bored, untroubled, until he turned to the page with the clause and read it aloud in that flat, dry voice, and I watched her face. I watched the boredom slip a half-inch and something underneath it look out. My son had gone very still in his chair. The cottage, my lawyer said, was never owned outright. It was held in trust, of which Mrs. Calloway remains sole trustee. The transfer to your husband conveyed beneficial interest only, subject to the conditions on this page. Those conditions appear to have been breached. This is ridiculous, the second wife said, but her voice had gone up at the end where it never went up before. That's an old paper. Things change. Trusts don't, he said. That's rather the point of them. Then the woman from Victim Services opened her binder, and she was gentle and she was terrible, the way the truth is when it's finally allowed in the room. She laid it out without heat, a financial transfer from a vulnerable young person's inheritance, justified by a property assessment that the township confirms in writing never existed, a signature obtained at a credit union by a relative of the beneficiary's stepmother. A clear conflict, she said, that the institution would be obligated to review. A young woman sleeping in an unheated cellar with documented signs of neglect. She used careful words. She used words like financial abuse and undue influence and failure to provide necessaries, which is a real thing in this country, a charge with a number, and I saw my son flinch at that one because some part of him still knew that Daisy was his. She gave us that money freely, the second wife said. She wanted to help her family. She was 19. In your custody as good as, isolated from every other adult in her life, and lied to about why, the woman said. There's a word for that, and it isn't gift. My son spoke then, for almost the first time. Mom. His voice cracked on it. We were going to lose the place. I haven't worked in 3 years. My back. Your back, I said. And I kept my voice low, the way you do when you want a man to lean in and hear his own life clearly. You let your daughter pay your bills with her dead mother's money, and you let her sleep on a cot by the well, and you told her it was her idea. I raised you better than that. I know I did because I remember doing it. I had to stop. I'm an old woman and I don't cry easily, but I came close there. What happened to you? He didn't have an answer. There isn't one. There's never one. A man like my son doesn't turn cruel all at once. He gets handed a little ease for every bit of his spine he gives away, until one day he's a guest in his own conscience, agreeing with whatever voice is loudest in the room. The unwinding took months, not minutes. I won't pretend it was tidy. But it was real, and I'll tell you how it landed, because the people who watch a thing like this fall apart deserve to know it actually fell. The credit union reversed what it could and reported what it had to. The brother-in-law lost his position and faced a regulatory review of his own. The trust clause held, my lawyer had built it well, and the beneficial interest in the cottage reverted to the trust, with Daisy named as the protected beneficiary going forward, which meant the second wife's name came off the deed she'd worked so patiently to get onto it. The financial abuse complaint went where such things go. There were conditions. An undertaking, the kind of legal leash that means a person can't simply do it again to the next gentle girl who comes along. And my son had a choice to make about who he was going to stand next to for the rest of his life, and he made it. And it was not the choice I'd have prayed for 14 years ago. But he made it. They left together. The cottage stayed with the lime, the way I'd written it before any of them existed in the shape they are now. The day they drove off, the neighbors' curtains moved up and down the road the way they do, and I didn't care. Let them watch. I'd spent too long worrying what people thought of a family that was quietly being eaten. That evening, I took Daisy upstairs to the big bedroom at the end of the hall, the one with the window over the water, the one I'd built first because I wanted to fall asleep hearing the bay. She stood in the doorway the way she'd stood at the top of the cellar stairs, like the room had a rule she hadn't been told. This was your grandfather's and mine, I said. It's yours now, not the cot. This. She looked at the bed, then at me, and her face did something I hadn't seen it do. It tried to make an expression it had forgotten the muscles for. What if they come back? She whispered. What if it's not really mine? What if I wake up and come here? I sat on the edge of the bed and patted the quilt beside me, the one my own mother had made, that I'd brought up in the truck, wrapped around my husband's old curling trophies so it wouldn't tear. Daisy sat. I took her ruined little hands in mine. I'm going to tell you the same thing I told a banker in 1986 who tried to take this property the first time, I said. This house was always protected. You were always protected. They just bet that nobody who loved you was paying attention. I closed her fingers around the edge of that old quilt the way you'd anchor a boat. They bet wrong. I came late. God knows I came late, and that's mine to answer for. But I came, she cried then, properly, the loud kind, the kind that takes up space and doesn't apologize for it. And I held my granddaughter while the light went orange over Georgian Bay, and somewhere out on the water a loon called the way it has every summer of my life. I don't know how to live in a house where I'm allowed, she said into my shoulder. I know, sweetheart, I said. You'll learn it slow. There's no clock on it. You just have to know the door locks from your side now, and the only person who has the other key is me, and I'm only ever going to use it to bring you tea. She laughed. It was rusty, and it broke in the middle, but it was a laugh, and it was the first sound out of her in 14 years that belonged to the girl with the gap in her teeth and the butter tart and the name she couldn't quite say. Stay, she said. I'm not going anywhere, I told her. Not this time. You're home, and so am I, and that's the end of it being theirs. I keep coming back to the smallest detail, the one I can't shake even now. A girl scrubbing a clean floor in tight little circles because she'd learned that stopping cost more than the work did. That image taught me more about how harm actually happens than anything in my 72 years. It doesn't arrive with a slam door. It arrives as patience. The second wife never raised her voice at me once. She just made the air between my son and me too expensive to breathe, one unreturned call at a time, until 14 years had quietly passed, and a child I loved had been taught there was no such thing as a no. Look at how it all linked together, link by link, and you'll see there was nothing supernatural about any of it. A grieving man hands away a little of his spine for a little ease, and keeps handing, until he's a guest in his own conscience. A gentle girl is told a septic assessment exists and never thinks to drive to the township office because nobody ever taught her that questioning a grown-up was allowed. That's the part that breaks me. Daisy wasn't foolish. She was untrained in the one thing that would have saved her, which is the habit of asking who benefits when someone tells you to sign. So, if I've learned anything worth handing down, it's this. Raise the ones you love to be decent. Yes, but decent isn't enough on its own. Decency without the sense to spot a manipulator is just a soft target. Teach them to think clearly under pressure, to ask the plain question, to read the paper before the pen touches it, to notice when a story doesn't add up the way that township record didn't add up the way that township record didn't add up, and teach them the steel underneath, the part that lets you stay calm at the side of a road and gather your facts instead of screaming, the part that drives 11 hours up the 400 on the strength of one nervous phone call because somebody you love might need you and you refuse to be too late twice. I came late. I'll answer for that the rest of my days. But I'd built one quiet thing right, years before any of this, when a dry-voiced lawyer made me write a clause I didn't think I'd ever need. That clause is the whole reason Daisy sleeps in a real bed tonight. Goodness gave me the reason to act. Clear thinking gave me the way, and plain stubbornness got me up that stuck mudroom door. You need all three. One without the others, and the patient people win. Don't wait to be invited back into the lives of the people you love. Invitations get intercepted. Drive up. Lean your shoulder into the door. And long before any of that, teach the gentle ones in your family that loving someone never once requires you to sign away your own footing to prove it.